This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome to the Metropolitan History Seminar, especially those of you who are here for the first time, but welcome to old-timers as well. And I'm delighted today to be welcoming David Roberts to talk to us. I've known David since he did the MSc in Urban Studies about 5 years ago now, something like that. Well, bits of it when I had contact with you was about 5 years ago. And he's gone on from that to be doing a PhD with Jane Rendell in the architecture school in the Bartlett. And I've been constantly fascinated by his extraordinarily imaginative, innovative, probably to me quite quirky ways of combining performance, research and all kinds of things. Before we start, probably I ought to just say that David had an accident yesterday, so he's a little groggy today, but so it's very heroic to be carrying on at all, but bear that in mind if at times, I don't know. Well, anyway, David has been doing research on East London housing, regeneration and the implications of it and the lead up to it, and particularly has worked on estates in Haggerston and more recently, I gather, an estate called the Brownfields Estate, which I assume is in the same area, but I don't know. It's in Pop. Okay. He's changed his title slightly today. He's going to be talking to the topic "Make Public."
Thank you. I think there are a couple of people.
I don't know if can we get any more chairs from. Oh, recording, yeah. We are recording the seminar at the moment. If you don't want to be recorded when we get to any question and discussion, then we'll switch the thing off. If David doesn't want to be recorded at that point, we'll switch it off. But unless you object or he objects, it will carry on recording until we finally adjourn downstairs in about an hour and a half's time. Okay.
I should probably start. Thank you, Richard, for generously inviting me, and thank you for coming. My talk is in 3 parts, roughly 15 minutes each. I'll first set out the context of my work by narrating this title, which you'll note is different from that advertised. Sorry for my fickleness. From this I'll move through the 2 case studies that Richard's explained in which the research and practice has taken place. And as he said, I'm recovering from a bike crash yesterday, 3 stitches and a cocktail of painkillers, and I'm afraid my talk might be in similar condition in parts, a bit creaky and stitched together, and soft in the middle actually. Historically, I think the rigour in the middle might fall short, so I'm sorry about that. This is a sort of methodological overview, I think, more than a sort of deep historical analysis, which I have done in each site. But I wanted to sort of present a broad sweep of my work and get your thoughts on it. So please be frank, tear it apart. I genuinely want honest feedback so that when I'm writing up, which should be now, I can sort of incorporate some real analysis. Okay. So the title of my talk is Make Public. This is an aspiration and a demand for me and my work and others working in public housing. I mean it in 3 ways: material, procedural and methodological. So talking through each of these will give context to my approach. So the first is the most simple. It's directed to politicians, developers, housing associations, councils. Make public housing. It's cherished, it's vital, make more. In the city that pioneered modern principles of public housing, in London, we are doing the opposite. The GLA released figures last month that revealed that they had doubled the amount of new homes on existing sites in the city, 33,000 additional units, but in this process there was a net loss of 8,300 social rented homes and only 1,800 affordable built, which is astonishing, particularly when put in the context of the history of public housing over the last century and a bit. So I briefly want to sort of take you through a whirlwind of political and architectural history, reading architectural literature and legislative acts in parallel. I focus on 5 key housing acts. The first is the Housing of the Working Classes Act in 1890, which was the first to properly deal with the legacy of poor housing inherited from the Industrial Revolution. Inspired by the work of philanthropic housing associations, it ushered in municipal housing under the London County Council. Up to World War I, this legislation sought to give security to rogue landlords in sanitary conditions and the acute general housing shortage. The Housing and Town Planning Act of 1919 introduced state housing at the provision of government subsidy. Prime Minister Lloyd George called for homes fit for heroes, dignified homes for veterans of the Great War, to replace slums and overcrowding with light, fresh air and adequate space. The Housing Act 1949 removed the obligation on local authorities to provide housing solely for the working classes. After the war, Health Minister Nye Bevan called for a utopian vision of mixed-use, classless public housing. The architectural profession was eager to contribute to the reconstruction of the city and wished to emulate the early modernist blocks designed by émigrés in the interwar period. And from 1958 to 68, council housing reached new heights, but sometimes cheaper system-built engineer-designed towers and slabs were decried as monolithic and characterless. Nevertheless, public housing reached its zenith in 1975 when a third of Britons included themselves as council tenants, including a fifth of the top 10% of earners, which I've always thought is a very interesting fact. The Housing Act 1980 introduced the right of tenants to buy their homes with discounts of up to 60% market value, ending the construction of large, single-tenure council housing and preventing reinvestment to build social housing, undermining equality, I think, by creating a 2-tier system of tenants and owners. The Localism Act 2011 finally introduced time-limited tenancies, accompanied by policies that relax social housing obligation and limits housing benefits. So decades of underinvestment in public housing have seen numbers fall to 1/10 of households, entrenching social and geographic poverty. Now, I'm sorry that overview for the historians here was very crass, but I just wanted to sort of give a shape to what I think the problem is now. One of my interests is whether a general but sort of notable shift in terms of reference, if you look at policy and if you look at secondary literature around the time, seem to have come about from municipal to state to public to council to social to affordable housing. Affordable housing notably a sort of misnomer because it's anything but. And whether these the shift in terminology constructs a different relationship between tenants and the state, and that's something I'm about to look into. Amongst political parties at the moment, there's a lack of interest, and major political parties, a lack of interest and will to build estates. Some suggest the set of cultural and political conditions for reinstating and reproducing it have ebbed away. And Mark Fisher, a cultural theorist, has quite a neat term for this: retrospective impossibilization. That is, that the form of housing and this more egalitarian form of society did exist, but now it seems utterly impossible in retrospect. The consequence is that independent analyses estimate 60% of London will become unaffordable by 2030, with up to 250,000 people facing eviction or forced relocation. Boris Johnson, a couple of years ago, decried policies as Kosovo-style social cleansing. And many studies demonstrate that making private is bad news not only for those on lower incomes, but increasingly many more. So my work in one aspect of it looks to challenge that most common estate biography, an abrupt descent from utopian golden age to dystopian reality, presenting a sort of common narrative, the death of public housing, declared either with relish as a disastrous experiment or with regret at the failure to deliver utopia. But in both cases, the story seems to foreclose any alternative endings. Experiments, projects, utopias are all finite. And London's housing estates, the architecture of this social endeavour, are imprisoned in this ideology of inevitability. This has material consequences. Perceived failures are invoked as a rationale for demolition or for complete refurbishment, both of which carry the threat of selling off public land, breaking up kinship networks as families and communities are dispersed. The second aspiration and demand is to make public processes of urban change. This should also be simple. We have many procedures in place that are intended to give platform to public scrutiny, but there are many barriers. In policy terms on a national scale, policy definitions are increasingly difficult to decipher. As I hinted at earlier, state-subsidised social rent housing is included within a subset category of affordable housing, which also includes the category of affordable rent housing, defined as up to 80% market rent of local areas, which is entirely unaffordable in most of London. So these terms are used completely interchangeably by developers marketing regeneration projects, and any scrutiny requires actually deciphering the language used in their planning documents. But even then, there's a surprising lack of precision, which many campaigns are now sort of trying to point to. The term regeneration itself has never been defined in government literature. It's recently been subjected to much criticism as a pervasive metaphor applied to problematic processes of urban change, often enacted behind closed doors, excluding existing populations. Perhaps because councils and housing associations are now operating ever more in the market, subject to credit ratings, focusing activity on the ability to attract investment as well as to provide for its residents, decisions and processes are increasingly hidden from public view. The benefits of having informed and engaged citizens seem to be calculated against bad publicity or a backer pulling out. This can be most clearly seen with developers' financial viability surveys, which calculate whether affordable housing targets make a development uneconomic. The economies of a scheme is worked out thus: all revenues minus all costs, including 20% developer profit, equals residual land value. If this value is far less than market value, then it's uneconomic. So developers inflate costs and reduce revenues, and that 20% profit is enshrined in law, which seems to be utterly remarkable. And the valuations are developers' own figures given to council planning officers in sessions closed to the public. What's increasingly troubling is that we're witnessing a further level. It's not just the issues to be discussed that are banned, but the very act of discussing. The client-based relationship of regeneration projects means practitioners are prevented from voicing their own opinions, concealed behind legally binding working contracts. The inevitable corollaries are an uncertainty and mistrust from residents. It's their voices that are most consistently ignored in these hidden processes. They're sometimes quoted, but only as sound bites. Rare are the full accounts and detailed studies and oral histories which do justice to intricacies and nuances. I think this has profound consequences. In terms of representation, there's little to challenge the crass tabloid cliches that ossify image of tenants as dependents and scroungers. And without public fora for debate to discuss these processes and express the lives caught up in them, there are no means to make public emotional and mutual support to people that may be feeling shame and despair from their loss of home. I think scholars have a responsibility too. We have great resources and skills to share with communities and organisations, but sometimes the way debates are currently framed in academia can leave many people affected most by it, unaware and unable to contribute. All of this, I suggest, raises questions of access. There appears to be a gradation of accessibility of sources, which go loosely from public to private. from cultural representations, film, television dramas, paperback fiction, media reports, policy documents, planning applications, all the way down to access to the buildings themselves, internal as well as external, access to resident testimonies, access to internal accounts from organisations and private financial documents. This scale isn't inclusive, and it doesn't necessarily go from simple to complex. Policy is ostensibly public but difficult to comprehend. Resident testimonies are private and hidden, but this recollection can be the most immediate and emotive. Academic literature may challenge media reports but can lie behind extortionate journal subscription fees. So the problem of access is a problem of knowledge, money, finances and time. My proposition, which is probably quite generous to those in power, is that no single person in processes of urban change has full access to this full gamut of information, whether that's a developer enacting change or a resident caught up in the processes. At its worst, there appears to be an actively constructed disempowerment, like viability surveys, where organisations don't want people to know how things work, so they can't be challenged. Residents have most to lose in this, their homes and their communities. But I think we all do, designers, councils, housing associations, researchers. We all lose by not being able to gain the real insight and full picture. This goes hand in hand with the material loss. As the public housing stock is increasingly privatised, so is access to information about it. Making public, then, seems to be quite a critical gesture. So to the final act. My thesis explores the history and future of two East London public housing estates undergoing regeneration, the Haggerston Estate in Hackney and Brownfield Estate in Poplar. It aims to make public process of urban change to those experiencing it, but also the act of research that I'm undertaking, through long-term critical practices of engagement and collaboration on site. The reason why Richard might have described my PhD as quirky is that it's practice-led, it's in architectural design. So I use quite traditional methods of oral history interviews, archival research and critical discourse analysis. But I want to share something more that I felt as a researcher those methods sort of give me on an emotional scale. So through these methods I sort of experienced two types of influence. The feeling of discovery that comes with the material encounter of handling archival documents and personal testimonies, and the feeling of hope and anticipation that comes with reading the intentions of designers, architects, planners, politicians, while knowing that their intentions weren't fully realised. As a performance theorist describes, there's an auratic materiality of a document which has an erotic charge. This comes with opening a box of papers that no one else might have opened in a long time. But she also points to the intellectually affective charge of this, which emanates from the idea that these documents promise to give access to. So it's my desire in my practice to share these emotions as well as the information within them, to convey the immediacy and personal involvement in this research, and to do so in a way that others are able to respond to, where the form and presentation conveys and supports its content. So my approach is an attempt to make public this research in different ways, not just information dissemination through journals, but an enacted and embodied process. So it's not just the outcomes that are public, it's the process of research. And this sort of becomes a reciprocal practice, so that people's interaction with it changes the direction that I take it in. So in order to do so, I've introduced concepts and methods from a sort of blossoming field of performance studies. Performance and the performative turn have influenced architectural theory and practice, pointing attention to the body and lived experience, occasioning a shift in emphasis from what a building is to what it does, and forming more nuanced understandings of how architecture is contingent on human relationships, actions and patterns of occupations through a building's life. And I want to take this influence of performance further into architectural research, drawing from how they treat archives. In their co-edited book Performing Archives, Gunhild Borgreen and Runa Gay draw on Jacques Derrida, to describe how archives are formative in shaping history, and thus perform human beings, structure and give form to our thoughts and ideas. It made me question how the archival research could be performed differently. Where could it be set? How could it be restaged? Performance theorist Heike Roms's proposition is that historical evidence is performed. The evidence is an event as well as a thing to be found. Evidence is always negotiated and constructed, not just found upon. The implications of this are in the way that we conduct research. She conducts oral histories with artists in different sites, with different audiences and documentation as prompts. She sees it as a scene of negotiation of the past, influenced by setting and influenced by the difficulty in articulating memory, and as a way of sharing memory and making it public. Like her, I'm interested in the typology of address and in using performative modes to involve others in research to make this act public. Another theorist, Rebecca Schneider, that's the finger by the way, work traces reenactment as a term that's entered into increased circulation in recent art, theatre and performance circles. She proposes that performance can be engaged with as what remains rather than what disappears. So this is a shift from preserving documentation of the past as correct to a suggestion that it can become score, script or material for a future instruction. Finally, I'm inspired by the critical approach of Jen Harvey from Queen Mary, who looks at the promise and pitfalls of performance in neoliberal times. She draws attention to practitioners like Marcus Coates and Home Live Art, whose performances can help us understand spatial changes in the city and its effect on social relations, as well as retrieve, protect, sustain and extend the equality of these relations through social gathering, engagement and collaboration. So drawing on the performative term, I'm sort of developing a methodology of site-specific workshops with a C, not an S, in which archival material and architectural literature is performed on the site that it addresses. It seeks to build different relationships where text and architecture is both tool and content, object and site of collaborative discussion. So for this I take inspiration from performative methods of dramaturgy and devising to consider modes of narration and elicit collective responses. The workshops are staged on different spaces of these housing estates, where the site aspires to become a sort of active participant in conversations. How can the site choreograph encounter with building and text? And I try to rebuild archives in situ in these estates, so people can decide how to read it, making visible material, personal histories and objects that they wouldn't normally have access to. And I don't want to just stage evidence of past events, but call attention to what we don't know, gaps in evidence. So the three objectives of this work are to use performance as a medium for residents to gather, embody and enact the history of their estates, invoking original ideals that might lie behind them and offering them for collective analysis against lived experience and critical text, to develop methods to bring in other communities of interest and facilitate a dialogue, to share the outcomes of these performances in an aesthetic that expresses agency and complexity of participants, and finally to establish strategies to feed all this performative evidence into more formal and legislative frameworks. So how can these retain a sense of historical contextualization and lived experience within contemporary policy? So I'd like to take you through the 4 workshops I've conducted on 2 estates. So I'd introduce the sites, the documents and the methods contemporaneous to each building that I've drawn on to narrate this process. So the first part is in Haggerston. My research and practice in Haggerston has been undertaken as part of the collaborative art group Fugitive Images, established by Andrea Lucas-Inman and Lasse Hansen, 2 long-term residents of the Haggerston West estate in Hackney in East London. The estate's 5-storey neo-Georgian wall-cut perimeter blocks were built by the London County Council in 1936 as part of its 10-year crusade to eliminate the slums. Following 3 decades of shelved refurbishment plans under the ownership of a local authority burdened by an offloading of quite a lot of estates and unable and unwilling to perform adequate maintenance, The last block of the estate was demolished in autumn 2014 to make way for mixed tenure apartments as part of an urban regeneration scheme, the City Mills, designed by PRP Architects, which aspires to build lively, diverse, vibrant communities in language typical of contemporary regeneration programmes. City Mills will double the density of the estate, featuring gated, secure access to courtyards and a hierarchy of access with segregated stairwells and private roof gardens for the sole use of owner-occupiers. My research there has occupied the stretched time between the decision to demolish and the action. In this long moment of suspended transformation, the informed and organised tenants of Haggerston's last standing block secured a right of return to the new housing development and compensation for delayed works. But rather than lament the loss of their estate, they remade its anonymous and bare courtyard into a joyful celebration of defiance against urban policy that threatens to separate and stratify. So it became filled with table tennis and picnic tables, delicately painted murals, and a communal programme of events that cultivated creativity and sociability. And I drew on residents' creativity to sort of amplify their critical voices, developing playful methods to trace the passing of their estate and the promises of public housing. So they were made with an ever-growing group of residents and local artists united by a desire to share their experiences. Over the course of 6 weeks in the summer of 2012, I ran a series of filmed workshops on the history of the estate. It was my intention to share and perform the archival history of the estate with those involved in its closing chapter. But like the residents, the archives were also in a strange limbo, caught in a period of extended transit while the new Hackney Library was being constructed, which was frustrating. Bereft of the solid grounding of archival documents and plans, I was forced to find another way into these histories. So the workshops were inspired by the only fragments of the designer's intent, well, as I read it, that remained. The names of different blocks that comprised the estate: Lovelace, Pamela, Lowther, Harlow and Samuel. Characters taken from the novels of 18th century author Samuel Richardson. Richardson was a devout Christian dismayed at the immorality of Georgian London. He wrote tales of virtuous heroines to reform readers socially and spiritually, in which each chapter takes the form of a letter to give the illusion of reality to fictitious characters and events. The decision by the London County Council to borrow these names, whether it was the architect, whether it was a librarian or a councillor, sort of implies a belief in moral improvement through this architecture like Richardson's, where the instrument of reform was not ink but brick. So we dressed in 18th century costume, like the estate's neo-Georgian blocks, to embody Richardson's protagonists. Inspired by his epistolary novels, each workshop began with a letter addressed to participants in the voice of different people who had influenced the nature and perception of the estate: the author, architect, journalist and politician. The letters were accompanied by contextual literature, academic texts explaining through different framings. I put the work of historians Parker, Pepper here, Revetz, Richmond, Roberts, Saint and Swennerton alongside contemporary thinkers, Bowie, Hanley, Hatherley, Manzi and Watt, drawing out the most exciting aspects of critical debate to explore why this past and present material might matter to someone who lives there now. These were read aloud before opening to wider discussions, questioning the vision and virtue of the London County Council at this time and Richardson's heroines, sharing opinions and expertise that cast aside stereotypes of this estate, which was in the 70s unjustly labelled the heroin capital of Europe. The second set of filmed workshops took place in the spring of 2013, in which a wider group of current and former residents tackled the history of public housing in London. Instead of letters, I took the corporate aesthetic of the presentation board of consultants as my tool and gave 5-minute lectures to participants on each era of public housing, whilst crammed into stairwells and balconies, kitchens and bathrooms, a bit like us. So where the previous workshop had used fictional narratives of Richardson as a sort of ruse to examine moral improvement, these workshops drew on the structure and content of a housing survey completed in the same year as the estate. In the 1930s, the public sector, private architects, campaigners, commercial organisations and policymakers conducted a large number of housing surveys. Competing visions largely aimed to convince policymakers, builders, managers, but also the public. In the 30s, there seemed to be a continual experimentation of different ways to research, and enthusiasm in presenting information in the public domain. Through the workshops, we traced the production of a survey by the Building Centre Committee, who embarked on an architectural grand tour of a very different kind, to survey a collection of housing schemes from 6 different European nations, selected by their representative municipal governments, and personally visited by the group alongside local technical experts in a spirit of, in their words, international common purpose, following a rigorous and standardised methodology. It seems to be quite a unique undertaking, this survey, entailing an extraordinary amount of time and expense, and it reads quite like a botanical textbook. So the survey includes the method of financing used, statements of housing policy, and within each scheme the architect is barely mentioned, so each is presented without expression to individual opinions, letting plans, sections and photographs speak for themselves, drawn on a uniform scale and with information on a standardised basis from which to make comparisons. The workshops we held were structured to reflect the form and content of this survey, to try and enable comparative consideration using legislative texts and standardised facts as a starting point and sequenced in accord with the chapters of the survey. So I'm constantly fascinated by how everyday experiences can challenge academic theories when they're opened up for discussion with those who they affect. And critical questions came to life as we debated how each room, flat and block was made and might be managed in response to a set of ideas about how society works, who does what and who goes where. So Oscar Newman's highly influential defensible space theory was disputed by residents beside security railings on the access gallery. Marion Roberts' historical analysis of how housing design is inflected by gender was considered whilst crowded around the stove. One output that's emerging from this is a website. The survey is praised by the then Minister of Health as providing an unbiased analytical record in an open exchange of ideas to encourage practical application of these lessons. It's labelled Volume 1, but no further iterations were completed. So I'm drawing on the principles I value from the 36 survey to form a basis of a website that looks beyond Haggerston, an open-ended Volume 2. This survey originally acted to make legible, clear comparisons between municipal housing at the time, and it's this clarity and honesty and sense of common purpose which seems to be no longer present in current accounts. So this reenactment is not concerned with authenticity but reception, to engage a wider audience, to foster debate, to use new technologies to make new empirical research legible and accessible. So my interest is whether a website can act as a medium for a survey today, not just directed to the architect and policymaker, but appealing to the resident and campaigner. Can the site create moments where private information is made public in the face of spatial policy that does the opposite? So to very quickly demonstrate how the website would work, when you go into it, this is a sort of test with 2 schemes in London and Amsterdam using information from the survey. It has general information from the survey, but it sort of updates the historical information with contemporary work. So in photographs you can trace how each area has changed. Maps, you can look at how different sites have changed over time. Sections aren't to scale, this is something we need to do, and plans and statistics, and if you want to understand how each statistic is worked out, it's very easy to understand, to find out the methodology. And the sort of reason for this is that the proportion and distribution of different tenures on different sites in housing today are actually very difficult to get information from. So whether the social housing units are located above the Tesco or round the back next to the car park, it's very difficult to sort of actually find this information and see it displayed. So that the idea behind a sort of online updated survey is that it can demonstrate the sort of weaknesses of housing today, a bit like that survey did back then. Okay, the other output was a feature-length documentary fiction film. As a sort of companion to the survey, it's a making public of the personal experiences of residents. So I'll conclude this part on Haggerston by showing a 6-minute cut of the film to let residents sort of have their own say, speaking on their own terms. So from the workshops, we developed fictional scenes that allow the sort of dreams of residents of Richardson's fiction to intermingle with the vision of its designers. This is 2 of Richardson's books in a duel against each other, Clarissa and Pamela. Clarissa is embodying the estate. She couldn't change the world, so she had to die. Pamela was willing to sort of influence society slightly in order to make it better, so she's the new block. The film interweaves these with intimate documentary portraits, and before I play the film, I particularly want to draw attention to one exchange between 2 of the residents. Smart, a 20-year-old Nigerian-born clothes designer, and Eric, an octogenarian Grenada-born former freediver. So after a long discussion on welfare changes and the redefinition of affordable housing, which I very badly explained to them, Smart and Eric reflect on the consequences using different spatial metaphors of hierarchy, Smart on geographic separation, Eric on vertical. And they speak quite quietly, but with conviction and emotion of those most profoundly affected by these inequalities.
I don't like what everybody likes. It makes it boring, isn't it? It's a bit of sunshine in the midst of this English weather.
I am Samuel Richardson, who created all these characters. I'm on a moral crusade to improve the ethical behaviour of the people, especially the young people of the country, through my towering literary genius.
To the actor personifying Lovelace House. Dear Sir, you are a 5-storey 1930s neo-Georgian flatted dwelling. You're one of 6 reformed perimeter blocks that make up the Haggerston West Estate. You house 32 flats. You face northeast, overlooking Haggerston Road. Your occupants awaken to morning sunlight streaming into their bedrooms.
I've got a little dog here, and my little dog has got more sense than all the governments we've ever had. They're nothing but a load of thieves. They're thieves. They're the ones who get away with the big crimes and the money. They're the ones. And if we get a small sort of offence, like we did a little bit of money out of social security, they come down on us like a ton of bricks, and they can take millions. They can take millions, and they do.
If we are ever to have good art in common buildings, that is to say, if the housing of the poor is ever to be done by architects and for careful plans and designs, architects themselves must be content to descend frequently from their lofty pedestals and speak, think, and work in simpler phrase. Architecture is not mere display, it is not fashion, and it is not for the rich alone.
I thought it was just crazy, because it's literally separating people. We've got different types of people in this type of area. But when they bring up an idea like that to triple the rent to 1,200, it just separates the different types of people that you're going to have in the area. And obviously you're not going to have people like us in the area anymore. Especially like students. A lot of students nowadays, and as soon as they get into uni, paying £9,000 a year or whatever, when they graduate, a 3-4 year course, they'll be in debt straight away. So you can't expect them to then want to rent a house or a flat with anyone. Straight away, they can't afford it, and it's just gonna really separate everyone.
You see, when it reached to that stage, there will be a kind of a class distinction. Mm-hmm. The people who have the money, they're going to get the good house, and the one who is underneath, he's going to be underneath all the time, and he's going to be down there. And the one who in top, going to just walk in, put his foot on him. Yeah, the one on top who could own it, and he could buy it, he get the good property, and the one who they under him, he's underdog for him just the same. He's on top, he stay on top, he get what he want, and he show up with what he have. And the man who underneath there, he's working hard and he's trying his best. But it's not to say he don't want to live there, but he just can't afford it, so he has to stay where he is. And sometimes when we stay in there, he suffers to an extent. Because what he really would like to do, he can't do it because he cannot afford it. And you see other men doing it because they could afford it, and they have this and they have that, they have big job, they working for big money, and they could afford that. And he's down there, what he could do? He wants to do it, but he can't do it. And that's it. That's how it goes.
Hey, Kieran? Yeah? I want you to go up to that other block and see how far you can hear it. Yeah, go on, away you go on.
Okay, final part. So, some context in an unorthodox fashion. The ballroom, Balfron Towers is a big, brutalist, demonic, imposing, decaying tower block in East London, in the shadow of Canary Wharf, in the Olympic Fringe, which stands 25, 27, 26 stories high. Its 146 post-war flats were built in 1963, in the 50s, in the late 60s, by an architect who moved into the tower for a few weeks, a couple of months, a week or two, but that was it, and left flooded walkways, cockroaches in the concrete, and residents fuming. He was a tall and powerful man, married to an heiress and a Marxist to boot. Precisely the sort of person to have strong and arrogant views about how to reorganise society. The tower positively shouts his clear but flawed view of the future. verticality is the cure. But why make the service tower separate? Why make the whole lot so high and thin it looks like it might fall over? I'm not proud of my next thought, but I found myself wondering, how come such a fantastic view has been wasted on the working classes and the destitute? These are not my words. This is Balfron Tower as an online chorus, the narrative comprised entirely from fragments of spurious fact, dissonant opinion and rhetorical questions from the first 100 articles on Google. And I've accompanied it with popular representations, as the tower's been the setting for films For Queen and Country featuring Denzel Washington, Shopping with Jude Law, 28 Days Later by Danny Boyle, TV dramas Hustle, Fixer, Whitechapel, and even the video to Oasis's Morning Glory. Balfron's representations seem to go beyond typical kitchen sink lazy stereotypes, way beyond, to fictive dystopian wastelands of feral gangs and zombies. While these accounts may disagree on simple details, this high-rise block's height and age and even name, they agree on a complex assessment: its failure. The latest representation I included is an immersive theatre performance of Macbeth by Rift, on site throughout June last year. The 5-hour show sees Balfron converted into the tower of Macbeth's castle, set in 1970s Eastern Europe, in which an audience journey from the car park, where witches are gathered around a fire, to intimacy of flats, specially created bars and a banqueting hall, where they feast with the Macbeths before being sent back to sleep until dawn. The choice of Macbeth is interesting, and considering Balfron's in the Borough of Tower Hamlets, I think they missed a trick. But I'd like to draw attention to how the performance was conceived and reported. Felix Mortimer, one of Rift's founders, explains how he was approached by the housing association that own it and asked whether he would like to use the tower. He said he was interested in how Balfron's utopian vision of the future, in his words, became a vision of dystopia instead. In this I see a similarity to Macbeth himself. The architect wants to be king to make things better, and he just ends up making things worse. The Guardian wrote, "At least temporarily, the decaying flats and empty walkways of the high-rise block will be brought back to life as the stage." But the flats and walkways were not empty. This most troubling act happened a few weeks before the performance, when residents were moved on from the 18th floor by the Housing Association to make way for it. Throughout the shifting course of opinion, both expert and popular, certain judgments of Balfron Tower seem to have been accepted uncritically, correlating its architecture of dramatic proportions with a way of life as stark and severe, ill-suited to the needs of families, and at a high density in which socialisation is difficult. We may identify facets of the building and its histories which form common sources of this failure: the scale, the sheer height of it, style, its brutalist architecture, condition, a material and symbolic state of neglect, the creator himself, the architect and his relationship with the building, and society, a chasm between ideals imagined and lived reality. The last of these is particularly notable for its modernism's failure to deliver utopia, the failure to realise the future in the present. This, of course, is bound up with architectural modernism's association with and reliance on the welfare state, honoured in its post-war settlement prime and maligned when it was condemned as anachronistic, as Adrian Fortes noted. I was initially drawn to methods that might help challenge these dominant narratives, archival research or history, privileging first-hand accounts and experiences that have never been shared or recorded. But, like Richard said, it's evolved into something else. So at this point I think a bit more architectural context is needed. The tower is one building of the Brownfield estate by Hungarian socialist émigré Erno Goldfinger, completed in 1967, occupied from 1968. The design is representative of post-war social aspirations, that of a community rather than simply a stack of housing units. Its central architectural and social move is to separate services, lifts, rubbish chutes and boiler room, as well as communal facilities for different age groups, laundry rooms, jazz pop room for teenagers, hobby room for older residents, away from the 146 well-considered flats in an otherwise detached circulation tower to symbolise and generate new ways of communal interaction. The bridges between the towers connect 9 access streets, with 3 floors of flats sharing one corridor to maximise opportunities for social encounters. All communal areas are enhanced by decorative and durable materials of high quality, such as a marble-lined entrance hall and coloured tiles and access walkways, demonstrating the value given to spaces and used by and belonging to everybody. In the past 47 years, Balfron has changed hands between many public landlords, and during this time, like hundreds of similar housing estates, the tower suffered from a lack of maintenance. Goldfinger died in 87 and couldn't have imagined the resurgence of admiration and popularity in his buildings. Balfron was Grade 2 listed in 1996 and is now part of an urban regeneration scheme. To afford the delicate refurbishment of a listed building, the Housing Association always maintained they'd have to sell off a proportion of flats. However, in October 2010, residents were sent notice that the refurbishment would require everyone to move out, with no undertaking on whether the socially rented tenants would ever be able to return. To date, the vast majority have already been decanted out of the tower and their homes temporarily filled by an array of precariously housed residents, and it will be fully emptied in a few months when the Housing Association will enter a joint partnership with luxury residential developers to privatise the flats. So in Balfron, my desire to challenge these dominant narratives is coupled with an urgency to capture residents' voices before they leave. I began with one-to-one interviews with residents in their homes in the tower. This domestic setting often implies a level of intimacy and honesty to the exchange, and residents were frank about the problems of living in the tower, the lack of sufficient funds for repair, unreliable lifts, as well as wider changes in the area with the building of Canary Wharf and new migrant populations. I felt privileged to hear them speak eloquently in universal appreciation of architectural details such as well-proportioned flats, the generous sense of light and space, and the importance of the view that's become vital to their sense of belonging, identity, and engagement with the city. And I felt angry that these cherished things would soon be lost to many of them. Without fail, every interview referred back to the most famous resident 47 years ago, the architect himself. Now, the tower was constructed during a decade when council housing reached new peaks in provision and height, but a large proportion of towers were system built and could be cheap and characterless. This prompted Erno Goldfinger, a fierce and imposing man, and his wife Ursula to move from their home in Hampstead to a flat at the top of the tower for its opening 2 months, in what he termed a sociological experiment. He did so to demonstrate his faith in high-rise living and to gather empirical evidence from new tenants by speaking to them individually, as well as inviting them in groups, floor by floor, to his penthouse for regular champagne parties, where the Goldfingers mingled with notepads, collating opinions on the new homes in order to document and remedy design issues. This didn't go unnoticed. Goldfinger's act generated considerable PR by the GLC at the time, noted in almost every mainstream newspaper in the UK, and even reaching Chicago. He announced, "I've created here 9 separate streets on 9 different levels, all with their own rows of front doors. The people living here can sit on their doorsteps and chat to the people next door if they want to. A communal spirit is possible even in these tall blocks, and any criticism that it isn't is just rubbish." Which gives you a sense of his character. Goldfinger took the building and its residents as evidence, yielding a very different narrative from that available on the first 100 records of Google. And his active research became a public performance itself and is recorded in archives held at the RIBA. Like Heike Roms, it made me interested in the conversation itself as a site of performance. Here's Goldfinger being interviewed by the BBC. What happens if you break away from a one-to-one conversation in a private setting? Once the setting is acknowledged as more than incidental, it becomes forceful and important. It's a staging, which in turn prompts questions about design, props, cast, audience, even script. Our first group event was held in September 2012, ending this era of Balfron's life as Goldfinger started by hosting a champagne, actually discount carver, party, inviting 30 residents to re-inhabit this period of the tower's history. So in a neighbouring flat to the Goldfingers on the top floor, we recruited 2 actors to play them. I scripted them based on writings and audio recordings of their interactions with one another. So there was a strong interview element, All night, Erno and Ursula went round asking current residents the same questions about their everyday experience of the tower as they did 47 years ago, using audio recorders this time, oh, that's a bit quick, not notepads, to record conversations in a dialogue between past and present. I dressed each room of the 2-bed flat with archival material in situ, making visible documents and personal histories that residents wouldn't normally have access to. The Goldfinger's family photographs in the living room, which some residents reenacted, the many letters he sent whilst he stayed there in the bedroom, and press cuttings and architectural criticism in the study. In interviews we'd conducted with elderly residents that had moved in there when the block was literally being built above them, they often described that their own parties first held here commonly concluded with rounds of traditional East End songs. So we invited a live musician to interpret these and improvise new songs based on conversations. The evening ended with a set of film screenings, including a BBC interview with Goldfinger during his stay. And there's something deliciously sort of 1984 about this, Goldfinger addressing his residents. He always called them his residents, by the way. And during the evening, they spoke freely about their experiences to each other and to the actors, telling Goldfinger of his inspiration to them, or telling him off for the things that didn't work. And the documents and settings were a trigger for memories. Dressing a flat that's identical to all residents' homes as an archive makes it estranging and uncanny, and it forced people to see their own flats differently. And residents shifted the power relations of the performance by demonstrating some of the details of its building, like the fire escape, to this actor portraying the architect. So the thread of performance created a setting whereby people stepped outside their daily routine into a mode of critical reflection, to re-examine their estate, their flats, and themselves. And it's important to note that the site isn't just physical, architectural, but a set of conditions, the ongoing debate of regeneration. When describing this process, each resident acknowledged the difficult financial decisions the Housing Association had committed to, but expressed a sense of anger that decisions had been made outside their control, and this impact on them. One resident said, "On the 23rd floor we felt magnificent. I think for social housing tenants to lose the view is such a terrible theft of experience. You live in the space in a different way. It affects your being, and that's critical to your entire existence. And for poorer folk like myself, it's a great loss." This restaging also touched on the spirit of the original endeavour. A community wasn't just reenacted in our performance, but reconstituted. People came together that hadn't met before and spoke on new territory they hadn't shared before. Some described this as a release, providing relief from the anger and frustration at years of not being listened to. But as I learnt more about the anger each resident felt at the privatisation of the tower, I worried their catharsis may prevent the possibility of further action being taken, neutralising political activism. What happens if that anger isn't taken to the next meeting? It reminds me of a quote from Augusto Boal, the Brazilian Theatre of the Oppressed director, who proclaimed, "I don't want the people to use theatre as a way of not doing in real life." Inaction seemed unethical. So I became interested in the enduring legacy of these individual and group testimonies. So, like Heike Rums encourages, it's important to recognise performative events as scenes of evidence creation. So there's a pressing need to retain and share this evidence as an ongoing collective resource in public, in real time. Our first performance was inspired by Goldfinger's residency in Balfron. The second was inspired by their other residency. Erno and Ursula spent every weekend after his retirement at the ROBA curating over 500 boxes of material, which are now quite hard to access and disseminate through restrictive protocol. This final act was Goldfinger curating his own legacy, but it's clear that he made special accommodation for the voices of residents amongst his own accounts. And as they've not had a stay on the building today, I think it's even more apposite they add their voices to this official archive again. Our second group event was held at the community centre at the foot of the tower in March last year. We used the occasion to announce that the ROBA had agreed to accept a new archive box from us to be added to the Goldfinger collection held at the V&A. This event reenacted an occasion where Goldfinger attended an early tenants association meeting, but according to the archive, which I don't believe, he only said one sentence, letting the residents share their thoughts openly and without interruption. So the actor portraying Goldfinger returned to recount his solitary line, and it then opened to a group discussion between this community of outgoing residents who shared stories, opinions and feelings, particularly about the renovation and decant of the tower, as they negotiated an array of archival material, personal narratives, photographs and artworks available around the room and on tables. So performing this construction of evidence for the archives makes the subjectivity and staging of it explicit, allowing the archive, normally seen as having quite a fixed authoritative character, to become more alive. Based on his experiences and tenants' feedback after 2 months, Goldfinger wrote a detailed report to the GLC to align the aesthetic qualities of his architecture, its form and its spaces, with social intentions. So since this, I've worked alongside James Dunnett of Docomomo to write a similar report as part of a listing upgrade nomination for Balfron Tower and all Erno Goldfinger's other buildings at the Brownfield estate, from grade 2 to 2 star. We did so for 3 reasons. The first, to recognise and protect the exceptional architectural quality of the estate. The second, to try and facilitate additional funding via English Heritage and perhaps make it possible for Culture Minister Ed Vaizey, an outspoken admirer of Goldfinger's work, to help funding for refurbishment still within the social housing sector. And third, to update the current listing description to reflect the social purpose of this housing and the social elements in its design. In support of this final point, I produced a supplementary document similar to Goldfinger's, solely devoted to residents' experience. So these cultural, financial and social reasons are, we think, supported by a solid intellectual case for upgrade, as the architecture of the estate falls within a category of British post-war modernism, explicitly interested not just in the shape of buildings, but social use. If these buildings are operated in the social good, then surely this should be recognised. English Heritage began their assessment last month. The second outcome is a website, again, an online version of the archive. So like Goldfinger, I've spent my weekends uploading and curating, and it playfully reflects the aesthetic of Balfron, an impossibly tall tower of documents, making public the wealth of information and knowledge, and trying to create a parity between academic text and personal account. The latest document to be added is a press release that's just been made public. I quote, "The joint venture has appointed Studio Egret West as architect to realise its vision to give a new lease of life to the building. Robert Sonning, Chief Operating Officer of London Newcastle, said, Balfron Tower is an inspirational building with an incredible heritage. We look forward to working with Poplar Harker and United House developments as guardians of this important building to breathe new life into it and help realise the vision that Erno Goldfinger had for it over half a century ago." So the extraordinary hubris of their claim to realise Goldfinger's vision as if he didn't himself seems to me to demonstrate the need not only to capture residents' voices but make public the sort of radical egalitarian intentions in the past against organisations that misinterpret and manipulate them to their own ends. The urgency comes as this history will soon also be rewritten in the building itself. So I began with the this final part on Balfron with an online chorus, and I end with an on-site chorus. The following is comprised entirely of fragments of residents' words aggressively edited by me. I asked each resident the residents together in the second meeting to recite this text twice. The first time they read it every line together. The second time they read out only the lines with which they agreed. So this invited residents to act individually and reassess their own words in concert with others. It's an exercise borrowed from another art group, Free, in only reading attributes you agree with and falling silent at other times. Your participation is restricted to agreeing with others or remaining silent. Some residents felt restricted by repeating others' words chosen by me, but it served as a pertinent exercise to demonstrate that however open I attempt to make these histories, however public, I'm still present in the work as media, director, architect. When they showed me Balfron, I said, "Oh, ain't it lovely? Like islands in the Mediterranean catching the sun." I was watching it being built and I thought then, what a mess. When I knew I had to live here, I wanted to run away. As soon as I moved in, I just totally fell in love. Imposing. Architects think it's a marvellous thing, but it's just another building to me. A bit brutal, scary, but kinda nice. There ought to be more lifts, like a battery chicken in a box. It opened up a new world to me. It's much more like a street than a typical tower. There was such a friendship. But where are the meeting spaces? The view is gorgeous, I'll miss that. The sunrise in the morning waking you up. Why do they want to make so many zombie films here? The horizon is closing in. The little bits of this area that make it like London will probably be eroded away. If Goldfinger was still alive, he'd listen to the people living here. Erno would listen. See this painting? That's me looking out of the window. That's how I feel looking out of the window. That's my image of my life in my flat overlooking London.